As David said, I do have the pleasure of getting to sit down the hall from David and Dan and Laura when she's joining us in the office, and we all sort of get to sit and think about what does this mean, and it turns into these really kind of nice sessions of what are we trying to do, what are they doing, how do we share it. So it's a pleasure, really. The GLISA project is focused on identifying and implementing adaptation strategies in the Great Lakes region. Our focus is primarily on working with mid-sized cities throughout the region, cities that are 25,000 to 300,000. And this is a 3-year project that comes together with a multidisciplinary team from the University of Michigan, bringing together urban planning, public policy, atmospheric science, natural resources, and the environment, and then pulling in all of those GLISA resources to really say, what does adaptation mean at the city level, and not so much trying to push necessarily for adaptation plans, but really how do you integrate adaptation strategies into the functioning of a city, and then how do you perhaps evaluate whether or not that has been successful. Some of the key goals, as I have here, are building out networks, and those networks include both trying to build networks across cities in the region, but also build networks that might cross from the public sector into the private sector, into the academic institutions, and looking for where does adaptation happen all over, across this region, across the sectors, across different scales. We develop these integrated assessments, which I'll talk a bit more about in the next slide. And then our third goal is the development of a climate adaptation decision support tool. It is the tool that we're developing is called the City's Impact and Adaptation Tool. I think it was alluded to a bit this morning, but something that we could put together that will actually assist in the decision-making process at the city level of saying, if this is your projected climate change, the projected precipitation changes, temperature changes, what are some impacts on your services and your infrastructure that you may need to be aware of, and what are some strategies for coping with those changes? So the GLISA project is an integrated assessment, and we take, I would say, and other people would say too, one of the loosest approaches to what that means. So we see an integrated assessment as something that works on multiple scales. So we are working both at the local level, we'll work at the regional level. There's conversations that happen at a national scale, and then also trying to maybe inform, sub-city, community, neighborhood scale. We're very open to unexpected outcomes, and from that we're also very open to a process that can change. So what we do as an approach in one given city may not be the same way we approach the question in another city. It is really flexible. To that end, the IA approach meets the problem where it is. And so rather than coming in and saying that we have a blanket approach that we're going to put down on mid-sized cities across the Great Lakes region to do adaptation strategies, to implement adaptation strategies, we're trying to listen back and say, what do practitioners need and what can we provide so that we're actually responding to where the problem exists in each of these locales. We try to use this to build coalitions and to build alliances. And in that process, we fit in trying to facilitate a peer-to-peer learning network. So working with a number of cities, learning lessons, seeing what is happening out there, and not necessarily becoming experts ourselves, but being able to say, oh, I know someone who has a program that can answer your question, and making that connection, really becoming that information and knowledge broker. When we started the project, this question of how do we engage decision makers, it was the first thing that we needed to address. We began with doing some of our background research, of course, including public surveying, as well as looking at the climate data overall. I think that we were surprised by what we found through our public survey. We surveyed a little over 2,000 people in mid-sized cities across the Great Lakes region. That included 8 states and 1 province. And we found that 85% of survey participants believe in the reality of climate change. Of those, 78% believe that human activities played a role, and 82% believe that it'll impact their community in the next 25 years. So we were able to say, this is a different kind of audience than we sometimes worry about when we go into the climate change discussions. That if we're looking at the audience as mid-sized city residents in the Great Lakes region, perhaps we have a little bit more opportunity to really bring this discussion forward. The first thing that we wanted to do when we were going to ask cities to partner with us in these questions was to put something of value up front. We held a workshop last November, just about a year ago now. We invited 13 cities to come and join us for 2.5 days to find out what are the questions around climate change adaptation in the region? What does climate change look like? What are some of the historical changes we've been experiencing, and what do we expect to experience in the future? And tried to say that, we're not here just having an extractive process. We also want you to know that there's something valuable that we can bring to the table if you'll engage with us as we try to answer this question of what does adaptation look like. From that meeting, we went through a city selection process. We asked cities to apply to be part of an integrated assessment that would last for the next 2 years. We had intended to have 5 cities. We had 7 applications, and we picked up 6 cities. And they're represented on this map. So we have Thunder Bay, Ontario, which sits on the north side of Lake Superior. Kingston, Ontario, way out at the head of the St. Lawrence. Flint, Michigan, Ann Arbor, Michigan, Dayton, Ohio, and Toledo. And we were able to, we chose those. One, they had applied. They had to demonstrate that they had buy-in from either their council or their elected officials or their administrators. And they were able to represent some climatic diversity as we asked this question of how will climate change impact your city? That's a very different question for Thunder Bay, Ontario, and for Dayton, Ohio. Dayton's maybe not in the Great Lakes region, but they're really enthusiastic about it, so they come anyway, which is a blast. And they also represent very different economic and demographic groups, right? So the challenges that you're facing in Flint, very close to Ann Arbor, those are really different questions, though. And how can we create programs that are unique for these cities, but also can be replicated across the region? And hopefully a lot of cities can find themselves reflected in one of these 6. So from the city selection, we went into work plans and what I call matchmaking. So this was saying, what is your need? Where are you? What are your priorities? Very iterative process, which then turned back to those PIs on our project and said, what are your research interests and how can you start to support some of the needs that these cities are identifying? In terms of the climate data that we found we need and use, the cities really need local services and local data. So Rebecca mentioned the historical data, and that's so helpful for us. Really looking at this local historical data and helping practitioners to know what is the climate that they currently experience. So we talk about what's changed from the 1951 to 81, 81 to 2010. I think probably a lot of you folks in here have seen the GLISA climatologies. They're an incredible resource, and they help decision makers to say, we've qualitatively or anecdotally experienced this climate change, but here's the quantitative data that we can actually plug into models and we can use as evidence when we need to start rethinking our stormwater system, rethinking our urban canopy program, rethinking the dam operators and that communication. And it's really not pushing a political envelope. It's saying that this is the change and this is where we are. When you can walk through that framework, you can start to say, well, what are some projection information? If that's where we are today, and that's maybe different than what you already thought, then let's look into the future, because now we can start talking about regional projections and talking about where do we expect the Great Lakes region to be moving into. We rely heavily on the climate divisions, the climatic divisions across the region. Look at the future information, then kind of go forward from there. An important piece here, as actually somebody in the room had said, that it doesn't matter that it's just getting hotter, but what does that mean? What does that mean for our city? And this is where we talk about the exposure data. And that's when spending time with these 6 cities is so important, because it's not just that it gets hotter, it's about where is there a lack of tree canopy? Where is there a part of the population that's more exposed to that heat? And how does the city plan a response for it? And so being able to bring that data about the climate, but combine it with the unique experience of the city to start to frame potential adaptation strategies that meet the need where it is locally and relevantly, if relevantly is a word. Relevant. Finally, the last piece is the management approaches, and this is about what can be done internally, and those are lessons that go across the cities. And one city's had a success here, perhaps you can test that out and share it. Our key findings have been that these collaborations are crucial. The collaborations that happen across the region, they allow for cities to have some political cover. If they know that their peer cities or the cities they would like to have be their peers are implementing certain programs and strategies, then they're more willing to take that risk and do it themselves. City practitioners want to know what others are doing. It builds a peer network. City governments are getting smaller, so finding peers that work within the city body is less likely. So finding peer networks for these practitioners outside of their own city is very important. In the internal education, a lot of good programs that are happening and nobody telling each other about them, and so creating opportunities for that communication. The final outcomes, we have a number of workshops. A lot of the resources are up on the GLISA website and available. We've now begun a small grants project. These are $12,500 going out to our 6 cities. And most of the cities are using that money as an opportunity to pivot from the internal view that we've been taking over the last year to begin doing external outreach and education into their community, building what I call political resilience or administrative resilience. If their community members support their work, then they have to worry less about what happens in the case of Chicago when you have a mayor who comes in and then eliminates that Department of Environment. And finally, developing these decision support tools. So we have an interactive map that's live, and then a new tool that we'll have a beta test of on Friday to help cities connect with what are adaptation strategies that are out there and what can we be doing here.